The entrance. The restaurant had always been an inviting place for anyone with a taste for the finer things in life. Nestled in the heart of the city, its polished floors gleamed under the warm light of golden chandeliers. The deep maroon walls were lined with tastefully framed art, and the soft hum of piano music played in the background. This was a place where patrons came to unwind, to indulge in culinary masterpieces, to savor each moment. Yet today, as I stepped inside, something was different. The bell above the door chimed, a sound I had heard countless times before, but today, it felt distant. The usual clinking of silverware and the sound of conversation seemed to fade as I entered, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. I could feel it immediately, the weight of scrutiny hanging in the air, not from one, but from every corner of the room. I had never been one to be easily rattled, but this time, the chill was palpable. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the weather or the absence of warmth in the room, it was something deeper. A quiet, almost imperceptible judgment that curled around me like a thick fog. The staff was scattered throughout the restaurant, but they weren't busy with their usual duties. No. They were watching me. The way they glanced up from their tasks, the way they looked me over as I made my way deeper into the restaurant, it was enough to make anyone uncomfortable. I could tell they didn't recognize me. Not as a regular guest, not as someone who had dined there for years, nor as someone with a right to be there. To them, I was just another man. Another customer, walking into their space. But what they didn't know was that this space would soon be mine. The hostess, a young woman with short dark hair and a name tag that read, Sophie, was the first to meet my eyes. Her smile was practiced, but there was something off about it. The way her lips curled up just a little too tightly, the way her eyes flitted from me to the menu she was holding, it all told me the same thing. She was sizing me up. Her gaze flicked briefly to the manager, who stood behind the bar, overseeing the room. I could feel his eyes on me too. They were wondering the same thing, who is this man? I didn't take offense. People like them, people who were too used to their little corner of the world, their perceived control, often judged without seeing. It was a reflex, one rooted in prejudice. A preconceived notion that only those who fit into their narrow understanding of the world deserve to occupy space in it. But not today. Not with me. Sophie finally spoke, her voice smooth but strained, a faint edge of disdain creeping into her words. Good evening, sir. May I help you? Her politeness was more mechanical than genuine, as though she was trying to convince herself that she wasn't being dismissive. I smiled, the corners of my lips lifting in a way that felt more like a mask than anything else. Yes, I have a reservation. She blinked, eyes narrowing slightly as she stared at me for a moment longer than was typical. I could tell she was trying to place me, trying to decide whether she should care or not. It didn't take her long to give up. Under what name? Alexander Wills, I said with quiet confidence, as though my name alone should hold weight. In some circles, it did. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and the faint clicking of keys seemed to echo in the otherwise quiet restaurant. She typed my name and waited. And I waited, too, though I knew the answer already. It wouldn't be long before she realized that my reservation wasn't on her list. I had already anticipated the moment. I knew they wouldn't expect me. A moment passed. Her fingers stilled. No reservation under that name, sir, she said, her voice soft, but her gaze a little sharper now. Perhaps there's been some mistake. I resisted the urge to smirk, because this was exactly what I had expected. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't just any regular diner. I wasn't just another man with a few extra dollars to spend. No, I was the future of this place. They just hadn't caught up with the change yet. Perhaps you should check again, I said calmly, my voice unyielding, giving nothing away. I made the reservation under my full name, Alexander Wills. She gave a noncommittal hum and tapped the screen once more. I could see the unease beginning to creep into her expression as she scanned through the system more thoroughly. It wasn't just about the reservation anymore. She knew something was off. The way I spoke, the way I carried myself, it unsettled her, and that unsettled me. "Let me confirm with the manager," she said, but it was more of a formality now, a way to distance herself from the discomfort she was clearly feeling. She turned to walk away, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. I watched her approach the manager, who had been watching this interaction from the moment I entered. I could hear fragments of their conversation as they spoke in hushed tones. The manager's voice was low, too low for me to make out the words completely, but I could hear the underlying tone. It was dismissive, condescending. They were speaking about me, not to me. They didn't know who I was, but they had already decided who I was. I waited, standing perfectly still. I could feel their eyes on me, and I knew exactly what they were thinking: another man of color walking into their world, disrupting the perfect picture they had created for themselves. The manager, a tall man with graying hair and an air of quiet authority, came over after a moment. His expression was neutral, but there was a glint in his eyes, something I had seen many times before in people who thought they had control. They thought they had power, but what they didn't realize was that it was fleeting. "Good evening, sir," he said, the tone of his voice far more formal than before, though it still held that tinge of superiority. "I'm afraid we don't have a reservation under your name. Are you sure you've made one?" "I'm sure," I said, my voice smooth, unruffled. "And I'm certain that your system must be mistaken." For a brief moment, he looked at me as though I were an inconvenience. Then his gaze flicked over to the hostess, who nodded subtly, and it was clear that a decision had been made. "We're fully booked for the evening," he said, his words polite, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. "Unfortunately, we will not be able to accommodate you tonight." I didn't blink. Not once. I didn't flinch at his words, at the dismissive way he spoke to me. I knew something he didn't. "I'm sure you can find a way to make room for me," I said with a slight smile. "I'll be happy to wait if necessary." The manager's lips tightened. He looked around, as if hoping someone would come to his aid, but none of the staff spoke up. They all stood back, unsure of what to do, their discomfort too obvious now. It was as if the air in the restaurant had thickened, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the door. "I'm afraid it's not possible, sir." I nodded slowly, giving nothing away. I knew when to play the game. "All right, then," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "But you'll regret this." And with that, I turned on my heel and walked out, the weight of their judgment heavy behind me. What they didn't know was that the very next day, everything would change. This restaurant, this place where they had built their little kingdom, would no longer belong to them. It would be mine. And tomorrow, they would realize just how wrong they had been. The revelation. I spent the night in quiet contemplation, my mind drifting back to the restaurant. To the dismissive manager, to the hostess who had looked at me with cold detachment, to the way they had all turned their eyes away the moment they thought I wasn't worthy of their service. I could almost still feel the weight of their judgment pressing on me, like a dark cloud that hung over my head, waiting to burst. But tonight wasn't about dwelling in the past. It wasn't about their prejudices or their refusal to recognize me for who I truly was. It was about what I would do tomorrow. The plan was set. The gears were already in motion, and no one, not even the manager or the staff, could have known what was coming. I had been biding my time for months, working behind the scenes to secure the place I knew I would one day own. The deal had been finalized, and the documents signed. But there was something immensely satisfying in watching them dismiss me, watching them treat me like an outsider when they had no clue who I truly was. It wasn't just that they had treated me poorly. It was that they had misjudged the situation completely. And now, they would pay the price for it. The restaurant had been a fixture of wealth and privilege, a place where only those who belonged to a certain echelon of society were treated as equals. People like me, people who didn't conform to their narrow view of success, were often shown the door. But what they didn't realize was that I had the power to shift the narrative entirely. To turn everything they believed about status and worth upside down. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the city, I dressed with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew what awaited me, and I was ready. The first light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wood floors of the restaurant, but when I stepped inside again, it wasn't as a guest. It was as the owner. The air was different now, thick with anticipation. I could feel the energy shift as soon as I crossed the threshold, as if the place itself recognized who I was, even before the staff did. I moved through the space with an air of quiet authority, my steps measured and deliberate. The sound of my footsteps seemed louder than usual in the silence that greeted me, echoing in the empty space. The tables were set, the silverware gleaming under the chandeliers, but there was no bustle of activity that usually accompanied the morning prep. In the back of the restaurant, the staff was gathered. They hadn't yet noticed my arrival, too absorbed in their early morning routines. But I could already sense the tension beginning to form, like the calm before a storm. There was something about the way the kitchen staff chopped vegetables, the way the waiters stood by the coat racks, that told me they hadn't anticipated this moment. They didn't know who was standing just outside the kitchen, watching them through the partially open door. I stepped forward, and at the first sound of my presence, the room went quiet. The buzz of conversation stopped instantly, and all eyes turned toward me. It wasn't the casual glance that I had received the day before. This time, it was different. There was a new awareness in their eyes. A recognition of something they had never seen before, something that filled the room with an almost electric anticipation. The manager was the first to react. He straightened up, adjusting his tie as though trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. His eyes narrowed as he took a few steps toward me, his usual air of superiority now replaced by a hint of unease. He wasn't sure what to make of me. He began, his voice betraying a note of uncertainty, I didn't expect to see you here again. Is there something I can help you with? I stood still, my posture unshaken, my gaze unwavering. I didn't need to say anything immediately. The power I now held in this place was enough to silence any doubts. But when I spoke, my voice was steady, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. Actually, I said, allowing a small smile to tug at my lips, I'm here to discuss the future of this restaurant. And, unfortunately for you, it doesn't involve any of you continuing your roles here. The manager blinked in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But there was no way to spin this. The truth was plain, and it was unfolding in front of him. I could see his mind working furiously, trying to process what I had just said, trying to reconcile the man who had been dismissed just hours before with the man standing in front of him now, calm, unbothered, and ready to take control. You see, I continued, stepping forward, this restaurant no longer belongs to you. I'm the new owner. And from this moment forward, everything changes. The silence in the room grew thick, suffocating. Every single person standing there, every waiter, every cook, every busser, had been so sure of their place in this world, so sure that they would always be above me. But now, the tables had turned. They were looking at me with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a growing fear that seemed to creep into their bones like a cold wind. The manager recovered first, though it was clear he was flustered. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to mask his unease, but I could see the panic bubbling just beneath the surface. You're joking, right? He asked, though his voice lacked conviction. You think you can just waltz in here and claim ownership of this place? No, I said, my tone steady, unwavering. I don't think. I know. His eyes flicked toward the staff, searching for support, but no one spoke up. They could all feel it now, the weight of what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was reality, and it was unfolding right in front of them. "I've bought this place," I continued. "And you're no longer in charge. In fact, your position here is terminated." The manager's face paled. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His attempt to regain control was futile. I could see the reckoning. The hours that followed my arrival at the restaurant felt surreal. The calm, composed manner I had adopted earlier began to feel more like a mask than a shield. As the manager and the rest of the staff processed what had just happened, their anxiety hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any attempts at normalcy. The truth had finally set in: the restaurant no longer belonged to them. The foundation they had built was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As I stepped out into the quiet streets, the weight of what I had just done pressed on my shoulders, but not in a way that made me regret the actions. Instead, it was the anticipation of what was to come. I had made my mark, but the real transformation, the change that would shake the very core of the restaurant, had yet to begin. The evening passed in a blur, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back in my office, reviewing the final steps of the transition. This restaurant was no longer simply an investment for me, it was personal. I had lived through enough moments where I was underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But those days were behind me now. What these people had tried to impose on me would be erased. I didn't just want this restaurant to succeed, I wanted it to thrive in a way that shattered their narrow vision of success. What had been a symbol of exclusivity, of privilege, of quiet but evident racism, would become a beacon for respect, equality, and opportunity. This was the change I was bringing, not just for me, but for everyone who would walk through those doors from now on. I knew that it would take more than just firing a few key players. The culture had to be overhauled from the ground up. It would be hard, but I was prepared. The employees, the staff, the chefs, all of them needed to understand that their position of power over the clientele had disappeared. They needed to understand that from now on, I would be watching. And anyone who tried to maintain that smug, discriminatory attitude would soon find themselves without a job, without a place, and without the privilege they had taken for granted. The following morning arrived with the same quiet anticipation that had filled the air the day before. But this time, there was no question in my mind about the outcome. The staff, despite their disbelief, had returned to the restaurant, probably hoping that somehow, it had all been a misunderstanding. But I would make sure they knew it wasn't. When I walked into the restaurant once again, the tension was almost palpable. The staff was already gathered in the back, no doubt wondering what to expect. There were murmurs as I passed through the restaurant floor, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. They were watching me closely now, the unease clear in their eyes, and it was a beautiful thing to see. I walked straight to the back room, where the manager stood, looking uncomfortable in his crisp suit. His face was a mix of embarrassment and fear, and as I approached, he straightened, attempting to regain some composure. "Mr. Wills," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I must admit, I wasn't prepared for any of this. We, didn't know who you were yesterday. I think there was some mistake." I cut him off before he could continue. His words were nothing but empty attempts to save face, but I wasn't in the mood for excuses. "No," I said firmly, stepping into the room with deliberate calm. "There was no mistake. The mistake was yours, and it cost you your position here. There's no room for people like you in this restaurant anymore." I turned my eyes to the rest of the staff, who had gathered in the room. They were all standing there, waiting to see what would happen next, but there was no mistaking the fear and uncertainty in their eyes. They knew what was coming. "I've already spoken to your manager," I continued, addressing them. "He's been relieved of his duties. His actions, along with the attitudes of some of you, have no place in the new vision I'm bringing to this restaurant. There will be no more judgments based on your perceptions of who belongs and who doesn't. Everyone who works here will be treated with dignity and respect, no exceptions. I could see the staff bristle at my words, some of them glancing nervously at one another. But I wasn't finished. I had made my point, but there was much more to be said. From today, everyone will be retrained, I said, my voice commanding and unwavering. You will learn that the customer is not a mere patron. They are human beings, and they will be treated as such. This means no more turning away anyone based on their race, their appearance, or any other superficial trait. If I see any further signs of discrimination, there will be no second chances. I will fire you immediately. Understand? The words hit their mark. The room fell silent, and for a few moments, no one moved. But I could see them processing. Some of them were already starting to nod, the weight of my words sinking in. Others still looked uncertain, but it didn't matter. They would fall in line, or they would leave. This was my restaurant now, and I wasn't going to allow the same prejudices to fester and thrive. We'll begin the training immediately, I said. All of you, go ahead and gather in the main dining room. The trainers will be here shortly. The staff shuffled awkwardly, moving to follow my orders, but I could see the reluctance on their faces. They had spent so long in an environment where they felt untouchable, where their small judgments didn't matter, and now, they were being told to change everything they thought they knew. But there was no room for that here. Once they were all in place, I stepped forward, watching them carefully. The trainers had already arrived, a diverse group of professionals with expertise in conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and customer service. They would guide the staff through the uncomfortable process of self-reflection and change. It wasn't going to be easy for any of them, especially those who had built their power on the backs of people they considered beneath them. But that was the point. Today isn't just about learning how to treat people better, I said, addressing the room. It's about understanding that power, respect, and humanity don't come from what you have, but from how you treat others. This restaurant can be successful without turning people away. We don't need to hold ourselves above others to be great. But if you want to stay here, if you want to remain a part of this place, you'll have to let go of everything you thought you knew about who deserves respect and who doesn't. Do you understand? There was a moment of silence before the first tentative nods began to form among the group. The tension in the room was thick, but the change was starting to happen. They were beginning to understand the weight of their actions. They were beginning to realize that what had once been an unspoken rule, the rule of power through exclusion, was no longer relevant. The training began, and I watched closely, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of resistance. But even those who had been the most dismissive in the past seemed to be engaging now, absorbing the lessons as if they had no choice but to comply. I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction as the hours went by. This was just the beginning. The transformation would take time, but the first seeds had been planted. The restaurant that had once been a symbol of exclusion and prejudice would now become a place of unity and respect. And I would make sure that anyone who tried to resist would find themselves gone. As I stood there, watching the staff shift, learning the lessons they so desperately needed, I realized that this moment was not just about a business transaction. It was about reclaiming my power, about showing the world that no one, not even those who thought they were untouchable, could escape the consequences of their ignorance. Tomorrow would be the first day of many where this place would change. The restaurant that had once refused me would now be a space where everyone had an equal place at the table. And I would be the one to set the tone for what would come next. The transformation. The days that followed my first official step into the restaurant as its new owner were filled with action. As I had expected, the transformation I had planned for the place wasn't something that could happen overnight. It wasn't just about rearranging the furniture or altering the menu. It was about reshaping the very foundation on which this establishment had been built. It was about digging deep into the culture that had festered here for so long, pulling out the roots of inequality, prejudice, and exclusion, and planting something new in their place. It was a task that required patience, resolve, and most importantly, the willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about the establishment. What had once been a sanctuary for those who thought they were entitled to the best of everything, simply by virtue of their appearance or wealth, was now mine. And I had every intention of making it a place where no one would be judged by the color of their skin, the shape of their body, or any superficial quality. The first few days were difficult. The staff, most of whom had been with the restaurant for years, grumbled under their breath, rolling their eyes when they thought no one was looking. There was resistance. And I knew it was coming. Change like this wasn't easy, especially when it meant tearing down the very foundation of what they had built their entire careers on. The training sessions had been uncomfortable. Some of them had clearly tried to skate by, unwilling to truly reflect on the biases they had so carefully cultivated over the years. But I was resolute. I had expected the pushback. I had planned for it. And while the staff was still adjusting, I made it clear that the price of resistance would be steep. I made no exceptions. Anyone who wasn't willing to change, who wasn't willing to embrace the new vision of this place, would find themselves out of a job faster than they could blink. The word had spread quickly through the staff: you either adapt, or you leave. It didn't take long for the effects of this new atmosphere to become apparent. Slowly, over the course of a week, the attitudes began to shift. The small changes were subtle at first. A once aloof waiter who had treated customers like they were beneath him suddenly greeted people with a genuine smile. The hostess, who had once given me the cold shoulder, began to make eye contact with every person who walked through the door, no matter who they were. Even the cooks, who were tucked away in the back of the kitchen, began to show more care in their work, taking pride in the meals they prepared rather than simply going through the motions. The real test, however, came the following weekend. It was a busy Friday night, the kind of night where reservations were hard to come by and the restaurant was packed with guests. The place was alive with energy. The laughter of patrons, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, it was the usual symphony of sound that had always filled the restaurant. But this time, there was something different in the air. The staff, who had once viewed the customers as nuisances or inconveniences, were now truly engaged. They didn't just show up to do their job, they showed up to make the experience special for everyone, no matter who they were. I stood at the back of the dining room, my arms folded across my chest, quietly observing everything. I watched as the guests interacted with the servers, and I couldn't help but notice that the sense of warmth and respect that had been missing for so long was now present. Even the manager, who had once sneered at me, was making a concerted effort to be respectful to everyone around him. He was walking with a newfound humility, something he had clearly never had before. The shift in energy was unmistakable. But then, it happened. The test I had been waiting for. A couple, visibly different from the usual high-end clientele, walked in. A man and a woman, both in their early 30s, dressed simply but stylishly, with an air of quiet confidence. The man was black, the woman was Latina. They were not the kind of customers the restaurant usually catered to. Most of the patrons who frequented this establishment were wealthy, predominantly white, and of a certain social class. I watched as the hostess, who had been doing so well with her newfound politeness, hesitated for a moment when she saw the couple walk in. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The smallest flicker of doubt in her eyes, the slightest hesitation before she smiled and greeted them. But this time, there was no room for hesitation. This time, I was watching. I walked over, calmly making my way to the front, where the hostess was still fumbling with the reservation book. She didn't see me approaching. I could hear the couple's polite greeting as they spoke to her, asking about their reservation. But something about the way they were being treated wasn't right. She had already begun to look past them, checking the system and giving them an apologetic smile that didn't quite match her eyes. I could see the doubt in her expression, the subtle bias that threatened to resurface. I stopped behind the counter, placing my hand gently on the book. She glanced up at me, and I could tell she was nervous. But she had made a mistake, and she wasn't going to be allowed to repeat it. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying a clear authority. The hostess blinked, trying to cover up her momentary lapse in judgment, but I wasn't having it. They don't have a reservation, sir," she said, her voice slightly shaky. I nodded, though I could see the couple beginning to look uncomfortable. This was exactly what I had feared. The old, ingrained prejudices, no matter how subtly they manifested, were still there. They were never truly gone. But I was determined to root them out, once and for all. I turned to the couple, offering them a warm smile. "I'm terribly sorry about this. There's no need to worry. Your reservation has been confirmed. Let me take care of it." The hostess blinked again, clearly startled by my words. She had no idea what was going on. But this moment was pivotal, and I wasn't about to let the couple feel the sting of rejection that so many had felt before, simply because they didn't fit the expected mold of the restaurant's clientele. I motioned for the couple to follow me, and we walked past the hostess, who stood frozen behind the counter. The rest of the staff looked on as I escorted the couple to their table. I could feel the eyes of the room on me. But this was my show now. I had taken control, and I would not tolerate any form of bias, no matter how small. Once they were seated and settled in, I turned back to address the room. "This," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is what we are here for. This is what this restaurant is now about. We will not discriminate against anyone, regardless of their background. Everyone who walks through these doors is a guest, and everyone is deserving of the same level of respect." I took a moment to let the weight of my words sink in before continuing. "If any of you are uncomfortable with that, I suggest you leave now. Because if you can't understand that basic truth, you won't be working here much longer." I looked around the room, at the staff who had gathered to witness this moment, at the guests who were now watching me as well. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, but there was also a shift, a palpable sense of change in the room. The old ways, the toxic attitudes that had run through the veins of this place for years, were being flushed out, one small but meaningful step at a time. And when I turned back to the couple, I smiled. "You're in the right place," I said. "Enjoy your meal." The couple exchanged a grateful glance and smiled back at me. It wasn't the kind of smile I had expected, though. It wasn't the polite smile of someone who had been graciously accepted, but the relieved smile of someone who had been given what they deserved from the start. That night, the restaurant ran more smoothly than it had in years. The staff worked together as a unit, engaging with each customer as if they were the most important person in the room. The energy was different. It was tangible. The customers could feel it. And so could the staff. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. This was a place where people could come to celebrate, to relax, and to feel welcome, no matter who they were. I could already feel the foundations of the change I had promised solidifying. It was a long road ahead, and there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more growing pains. But it didn't matter. I had already made my mark. I had already set the tone for what this restaurant would become. And I knew it would only get better from here. The struggle and triumph. The days after my speech to the staff continued to be a delicate balance of tension and progress. The transformation I was striving for was far from easy. It wasn't enough to simply tell the staff to be respectful and kind. It wasn't enough to say the right words. It was about creating a culture that would hold everyone accountable, a culture where no one, whether employee or patron, could feel superior or less than based on their skin color, background, or economic status. That required action, follow-through, and, most importantly, time. I spent the next several weeks observing, intervening when necessary, and setting up new training sessions for both the kitchen staff and the front-of-house team. I didn't just want the staff to understand that change was necessary. I wanted them to internalize it, to make it a part of who they were, not just something that was being forced upon them. In the beginning, there were subtle signs of resistance. I had anticipated them. A few of the servers tried to skirt the rules, half-heartedly complying with the new standards while continuing to exhibit small, dismissive behaviors. A brief roll of the eyes when a couple of color walked in, or a barely audible sigh when a less wealthy guest approached the host stand. These were the remnants of old habits, the undercurrent of entitlement that had long been woven into the fabric of the restaurant. It frustrated me, but it didn't surprise me. I knew the true test would come when the stakes were higher, when it became impossible for them to hide their biases. So, I waited. I watched. But there was also progress. Some of the staff, especially those who had been with the restaurant the longest, began to show signs of genuine change. I could see it in their eyes, the awareness, the discomfort with their old ways, the acknowledgement that their attitudes and actions had been wrong. It was a slow process, but it was a process. And in the meantime, I made sure the new hires understood what the future of this place would look like. The staff who had remained, however reluctantly, had been given a chance to change. They were now held accountable not just by me, but by each other. They were expected to uphold the standards I had set, or they would be let go without question. The next Real test came one Friday evening, when a high-profile event was scheduled to take place at the restaurant. A wealthy couple was hosting their anniversary celebration in one of the private rooms, and they had made a special request for the best treatment possible. This event wasn't just another dinner reservation, it was an opportunity for the restaurant to prove that the changes I had implemented were not temporary. The couple who had made the reservation was known in certain circles, and they had their pick of any restaurant in the city. They were used to being treated like royalty. It was their expectation. This was a night they had waited for, and they expected nothing but perfection. When they arrived, I was standing near the entrance to personally welcome them. I knew that I couldn't afford any missteps. Every person on the staff needed to be at the top of their game. But as I looked toward the door, I saw something I hadn't anticipated. The hostess, a newer hire who had been trained in the new values, was visibly nervous. She was young, eager to prove herself, but I could see that she was doubting herself. The couple was dressed in the finest attire, and I noticed her hesitation when she looked at them. It was a brief, almost imperceptible moment, but it was a moment I couldn't ignore. She had already decided in her mind that these guests were different from the others. They deserved better treatment because they were wealthy, because they fit into the category of important. It was an old pattern, an old reflex that had long been ingrained in the restaurant staff. I didn't say anything immediately. I watched as she greeted them, fumbling with the reservation book, trying to mask her discomfort behind a forced smile. But I was ready to step in if necessary. The guests were polite, but I could tell that they were already making their judgments. They noticed the staff's nervousness. They noticed the way the hostess couldn't quite hide her discomfort. And before I could intervene, the husband turned to me, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with the entitlement that only people like him could possess. "There seems to be a problem. We don't want to wait for a table. We're important guests, and I'm sure we should be seated immediately." I smiled, though I could feel a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. This was the test. This was where the change had to be proven, where the old mindset of catering only to the wealthy, the privileged, had to be eradicated. "Of course, sir," I said calmly, approaching them with a sense of unwavering confidence. "You'll be seated immediately. But I want you to understand that everyone here, whether they're sitting at the bar or in the private dining room, is treated with the same respect. No one is more important than anyone else, regardless of who they are or what they can pay for." His expression faltered for a second, confusion crossing his face. He hadn't expected such a response. But I wasn't finished. I've made it clear to my staff that all of our guests are equally valued here. That includes you, I said, the words firm but not unkind. And I hope that you will appreciate the respect that we offer to all people, not just the ones who fit the mold of your usual clientele. The husband opened his mouth, no doubt preparing to fire back, but he stopped himself. For a moment, there was silence. It was as if he didn't know how to respond, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he hadn't expected anyone to challenge him. And that was exactly what I was doing. I was challenging the assumptions that had governed the restaurant for far too long. I was reminding him that the real value of this place wasn't in the amount of money people spent, but in the way they treated one another. It wasn't about making the rich feel more powerful. It was about creating an environment where everyone, no matter their background, could feel at home. The hostess, now understanding the situation, recovered quickly and smiled genuinely at the guests, inviting them to their table without hesitation. As I watched them walk to their seats, I could see the subtle shift in their demeanor. They had expected to be treated with deference, but instead, they were treated with respect. The difference was clear, and I could tell they were processing it. Whether they understood or not, it didn't matter. The message had been sent. As the night went on, the restaurant ran flawlessly. The new staff members shone brightly. The servers were attentive but not obsequious. The chefs were focused on delivering dishes that were not just great in taste but in the way they presented them to every guest. I watched the entire evening unfold with a quiet pride. The atmosphere had changed. No longer was it a place where certain people were treated as special, while others were treated as less than. It was now a place where respect was the foundation, where every guest mattered. And, for the first time, I truly felt like this place was mine. It wasn't just the physical restaurant, it was the people. It was the culture. It was everything I had worked so hard to cultivate in the weeks since I had taken over. This restaurant had finally become what I had envisioned. It wasn't a symbol of exclusivity or privilege. It was a symbol of equality and respect. By the end of the evening, I could see the difference in the staff. The old habits were still there, but they were being replaced by new ones. They were beginning to understand that their value as workers wasn't measured by how they made the rich and powerful feel, it was measured by how they made everyone feel, no matter who they were or what they had. I walked through the restaurant that night, taking in the conversations, the laughter, the joy that filled the space. There was still a long road ahead, but I knew that this was the beginning of something incredible. I had turned the tide. I had proven that change was possible. And this time, the restaurant wasn't just for the rich. It was for everyone. The legacy. The weeks following the high-profile anniversary celebration continued to unfold with quiet, steady progress. While the restaurant had made significant strides, the shift in culture I had initiated wasn't an overnight change. It required more than just one successful night or a single transformative event. It was a journey, and every day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new lessons. I knew that the hardest work was still ahead of me. In the early days, many of the staff members had embraced the changes I'd implemented. They had been receptive to the new expectations, understanding that their old ways of thinking and acting could no longer be tolerated. But it was clear that some of them were still fighting the transformation in subtle ways. Some still struggled with letting go of their old biases, while others resisted the idea of a true, equal opportunity for everyone who walked through the door. It was the remnants of privilege, the idea that some people were better than others simply by virtue of their wealth, race, or status, that was hardest to overcome. But, I had a plan. The work wasn't just about changing their outward behaviors, it was about shifting their mindset. I needed to instill in them the understanding that a truly great restaurant wasn't one where people who belonged were catered to. It was a place where everyone was treated with the same kindness, respect, and genuine care. I had always known that the road to lasting change would be difficult. People who had been in this industry for years, who had spent their lives conforming to the unwritten rules of elitism and exclusivity, weren't going to simply shed those habits without some serious effort. But I had seen the flickers of transformation in their eyes, the understanding that what we were doing here was bigger than serving food. It was about healing, about making right what had been so wrong for so long. One particular evening brought an unexpected test that would ultimately serve as a turning point. It was a busy Saturday night, and the restaurant was packed. A couple had reserved a table for two in one of the best sections of the restaurant, a spot near the window with a panoramic view of the city skyline. They were dressed in high-end fashion, exuding wealth and confidence. But as they entered, there was something about the way the hostess greeted them that sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I had been standing near the entrance when the couple arrived, and I noticed immediately the subtle shift in the hostess's demeanor. Her smile was a little too tight, her greeting a little too stiff. I watched as she tried to engage with them, but there was an awkwardness in the air that hadn't been present in recent days. Something didn't sit right. I observed their interaction closely, walking toward the hostess to see what was going on. The couple, despite their wealth and high status, seemed to feel the same discomfort. The man, a middle-aged individual with a well-groomed beard and sharp suit, was looking at the hostess with an air of condescension, as though he were accustomed to being treated with the utmost deference. His posture stiffened, and his gaze flicked to me, as if silently asking for confirmation that he had my full attention. The hostess was nervous, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. It wasn't just the formality of the greeting that made things feel off. I could see the subtle but unmistakable hesitation in her movements, the flicker of doubt in her eyes as she tried to make the couple feel welcomed. And then, the man spoke, his voice smooth, but laced with an edge of entitlement. "We requested the best seat in the house," he said, his words deliberate, eyes scanning the room as though he was measuring everything around him. "I trust there's been no mistake." His tone was unmistakable. It was the kind of arrogance that I had fought to eradicate from this place. I had seen it countless times, patrons walking in as if they owned the restaurant simply because they had the money to do so. But now, it wasn't going to stand. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, catching the man's eye as I approached. He paused, his gaze sharpening as I made my way toward them. I could feel the tension in the air, an almost electric charge as the moment played out in slow motion. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I'm Alexander Wills. I own this restaurant." He blinked, clearly surprised to hear my name, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. The recognition began to settle in, and a flicker of realization crossed his face. But instead of backing down, he stood taller, his posture still rigid with entitlement. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "I'm a regular here. My family has dined at this establishment for years. We don't need an introduction. We expect the best, just like we always have." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. But I didn't let it show. This wasn't about me. This was about what I stood for. This was about making sure that the respect I demanded for every guest, no matter who they were, was finally understood. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The best," I said calmly, "isn't something that's given to only a select few. It's something we provide to everyone who walks through these doors. This restaurant isn't just for those who can pay for it. It's for everyone, regardless of their background or their wealth. And you, sir, will be treated with the same respect as anyone else." There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought the man might argue. But instead, something in him shifted. I could see it in his eyes, the crack in his veneer of superiority. He glanced at his companion, a well-dressed woman who had been standing quietly at his side. She exchanged a look with him, and for the first time, the arrogant rigidity that had defined the moment seemed to soften. "You're right," the man said, his voice quieter now, his earlier edge gone. "I suppose we've been taking things for granted. His tone had shifted, and that was the moment I knew the transformation wasn't just happening among the staff. It was happening within the patrons, too. They were starting to see the restaurant for what it truly was. A place where respect was given freely, no matter who you were. I nodded, my smile finally reaching my eyes. "Thank you for understanding," I said. "Let me show you to your table." As I led them to their seats, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. This was what I had been working toward. This was the moment that confirmed everything I had done. It wasn't just about changing the restaurant for the better, it was about changing the hearts and minds of everyone who entered it. The night continued smoothly, with the staff working with renewed energy and purpose. The couple who had once walked in with an air of superiority now sat comfortably at their table, engaging with the staff as equals, with respect. The transformation had taken hold, not just within the restaurant's walls, but within the hearts of those who walked through its doors. When I looked around that evening, I no longer saw a place where people came only to indulge their privilege. I saw a restaurant where everyone was welcomed, treated with kindness and dignity. It was the embodiment of the change I had set into motion months ago. And as I walked through the dining room, taking in the energy that now filled the space, I knew that the legacy of this restaurant would be something far greater than it had ever been before. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place where people came together, where differences were celebrated, and where respect was the foundation of everything. The work was far from over. There would always be challenges, always moments of doubt, always resistance. But I had already made an indelible mark. And as long as I was here, as long as this restaurant remained under my ownership, the values of respect, equality, and opportunity would remain at its core. This was the legacy I was building, a legacy that would endure, long after the old ways had faded away.